I can go get them real quick.
Okay, please.
Young adults are much less trusting of police than middle-aged and older adults.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. The noise complaint in the Idaho murders Bodycam raises a troubling question. It's about trust. We all thought the same thing, didn't we? When B opened the door, and by the way, I'm going to refer to the surviving roommates by the initials of their first names, B and D. When B opened the door and never came back, I think we all thought the same thing. We found that surprising and perhaps a little disappointing. The cops standing outside felt the same way. When B left, they waited and waited, trusting that she would do as she said, which is have someone come down and deal with the situation. Ultimately, no one did, and the cops' trust was betrayed. Until now, this is an area we've sort of accepted. While there were always a few questions surrounding the situation of the 911 call, there was never really a question, at least not in my mind, that the surviving roommates, one or both, committed quadruple murder, especially not with a knife. Why would they? And that remains the case. The noise complaint Bodycam doesn't mean B and D aren't trustworthy at all. I mean, we don't swing the needle to zero. It doesn't go from maximum trust to minimum trust. But it does need to shift in some way. What needs to change, in my opinion, is that we have to adjust the trust meter from wherever it was, not completely in the green, but mostly in the green, to somewhere more in the yellow. We want to put it in a more accurate, make it a more accurate measure than we've had it before. So when we adjust the trust level lower, it means we also have to reevaluate what we know in terms of the 911 calls, as well as the discovery of the victims on that Sunday morning, on the 13th of November. We are going to, in this episode, we're going to deal with 5 disturbing intertextualities. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you have subscribed, welcome to the True Crime Rocket Science community. We call ourselves Scouts, and we like to be good people. We like to be part of the greater good, and we like to believe that what we are doing is good. And we like to be the good guys. We like to keep things honest. We do the difficult work of trying to keep true crime something that is an asset to society, where we actually try to solve cases. And we try and find a way in all of this darkness to the light, where we learn some kind of lesson out of these incidents. And in that sense, we are like trees growing towards the sunshine, putting our roots in dark places, analyzing and sort of finding our way, but nevertheless bearing fruit from what we learn from that sort of thing. And that is why we refer to ourselves as peaches as well. So if you're one of them, welcome. If you're enjoying the content here, like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So 5 disturbing intertextualities. What is an intertextuality? It is a intertextuality within the fabric of the case. It's not referring outside of the case to something else. It's essentially intertextual in a psychological sense or a true crime sense, echoing a pattern within that fabric that tends to repeat itself. So what we are going to do now is figure out intertextualities in terms of this body cam on September 1st and how it may relate to November 13th. Does that make sense? So let's start. Number 1, during the noise complaint, the guys seem to be running interference in terms of dealing with the cops. This may have effectively been a kind of dress rehearsal for how to deal with the cops 2.5 months later. I don't mean that they were practicing consciously, but that effectively that was what it was. That the way they behaved there was a kind of pattern for how they behaved later on. We actually have a similar intertextual situation in the JonBenet Ramsey case, when cops were summoned to a house full of people on December 23rd, 2 days before that incident. So on November 13th, is it any surprise that the guys, and I'm assuming it was boys, dealt with the 911 call, similar to those who took charge at the front door? Number 2, minimizing and misdirection. Let's face it, the cops were led to believe the girls would come down and assist. And while the cops were assuming that they were going to be acknowledged and there would be some kind of interaction, they were merely somewhere else. The people inside the house were merely biding their time, doing whatever they were doing. This may not have been accurate or truthful, strictly speaking. The whole thing of, don't worry, someone's going to come down and help you. In the same way, by describing only one victim as unconscious, that may not have been accurate or truthful either. I mean, didn't they try to contact any of the others while they were trying to get hold of one roommate that was incommunicado? Didn't anyone look for anybody else? So the 911 call seemed mostly harmless, but was it? Sorry, we've got someone here that's unconscious. Really? Let's listen briefly to Henri van Breda, the triple axe murderer. If his sister had died in this attack, it would also have been a quadruple murderer. Now he's sitting in the scene. There are 3 people that have bled to death upstairs. His sister's injured, actually could be dying at any moment. And listen to him. Does this sound like he's telling the operator, it's the South African version of a 911 call, does this sound like he's telling the operator accurately what is going on? Or is he minimizing it? Does it sound urgent and real and realistic? Or does it sound like he's kind of minimizing what has happened? Let's listen in.
Who is injured?
I think everyone.
Everyone in your house?
Everyone, 4 people, yes.
Adults, 2 adults?
2 adults and 3 adults and 1 teenage girl, yes.
What are the injuries?
Head injuries.
Are they conscious?
I don't think so. My sister's moving, but that's it.
Suspect still on scene there, sir?
Well, it turned out the suspect was still on scene. The suspect ended up being Henri himself, and he was ultimately convicted of triple murder. Do you notice how when the operator asks, are the victims conscious or not, he doesn't really correct them to say they are very likely dead, right? He doesn't really correct them. So in that sense, what we're dealing with here is minimizing and misdirection. That's in the Henri van Breda case. What about in this case? What about when they called and said, well, someone seems to be unconscious? Now, in the same way with the Henri van Breda call, and I'll put a link to that if you're interested in listening to the whole thing. I have written a couple of books on that case. If you're interested in that whole thing, the important thing to really look at isn't what is said so much in that call, but what isn't said, what is left out, what is selectively not revealed, right? And so we don't know what the 911 call was, but we know the word unconscious was used, and we know what has happened in this noise complaint, where there's a sort of a sly avoidance of a certain amount of facing up to the music, right? And literally, because it is a noise complaint. But what I'm talking about is there's no mention of blood or anything broken, right? I'm assuming that. I'm assuming when they called 911 and they said, you know what, there's someone unconscious here. I don't think they said, I think there's someone bleeding. I think this is a life and death situation. I wonder whether it's not the same as Henri van Breda, right? Now, when the boys came over to the house in the middle of the day, and again, I'm assuming it is guys. I'm assuming some of the people we see in this body cam from September 1st are some of the people who would have come over. They lived next door. They were regulars. Didn't they notice the blood outside Xana and Ethan's room, if or when they weren't able to get inside that room? Didn't they try to use a ladder perhaps to look inside the window? So if you can't get inside a room, what's the next port of call? Well, you might knock on the door. If you can't get hold of them that way, wouldn't the next thing be to try and look in the window? Maybe knock on the window. And then after that, maybe you try to call them. Maybe you'd start shouting. Maybe you'd try and see if any of the other roommates know what's going on. But what would really get you to fixate on the room, actually? Or wouldn't it be blood? What would cause you to not just shrug your shoulders, maybe they are hungover, let's go out for coffee and come back later? Well, how about blood? How about broken things, right? That brings us to the third aspect. Isn't time an issue? We've assumed thus far that B&D's story is basically trustworthy. We've also assumed calling 911 at noon, at 11:58 a.m., being awoken in the middle of the day, basically 10 to 11 hours after they went to bed. And this is assuming they went to bed at 1 a.m. before the others arrived home. That might not be right. But regardless of when they went to bed, the 11:58 a.m. call is on the late side. Would you agree with that? It's a bit late. It's really the middle of the day. And it's interesting that that resolution to what happened in that house is close to the time that JonBenet Ramsey was eventually found, also in the middle of the day, despite everything happening hours and hours earlier. It's a similar situation also to the murder of Meredith Kircher. Eventually, it's almost the middle of the day and people decide, okay, maybe we need to do something. If the front door was wide open, didn't the cold air or noise outside, cars driving by, people walking by, talking, laughing, shouting, wake them up at any point between 8:30 and 11:58 a.m.? One of the things we intuit from the officers standing there is you can clearly hear what's going on inside, outside. So with an open door, how hard would it be to hear what is going on outside, inside, if you're trying to sleep inside? During the noise complaint, there was also a very long period where the girls were supposed to come down and deal with something, and instead something else was happening. Was the something else happening after the discovery of the crime here as well? If so, how long was the something else happening? Was it half an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? All we know is in the noise complaint situation, it felt like an unnecessary long time for nothing to happen. Isn't that the case in terms of the events of November 13 as well? There's not necessarily much relevance or significance to the crime itself, as long as the girls or boys never entered the actual crime scenes, actually never went inside those bedrooms to remove who knows what. We don't know if they did, but if they did, that could cause serious problems, jeopardizing this case. Number 4, was there some covering up within a cover-up? If the survivors in the funhouse did a little spring cleaning that cold autumn morning, the same sort that the partygoers may have done when the officers pitched up to issue the noise complaint, then could that muddy any other actual cleaning or covering up by the killer? Number 5, in sum, do the survivors know more than they've let on? And if sharing this knowledge of certain transactions and dealings, which might be self-incriminating, are there holes in the story? And are these the loopholes that are allowing the killer to stay one step ahead? Just this whole idea of running away and not actually dealing with the issue may be something the survivors are used to doing in a certain sense. It's possible as time goes by, as weeks turn into months, and the focus shifts to the reality that 4 of their friends are dead, that despite the actions of the cops, something else has happened that really affects them and affects those close to them. and the killer is still out there, no thanks to them. Perhaps as time goes by, some of the personal feelings potentially still obstructing this case may fall away. One does get a sense now that when the cops hold their press conferences and ask for tips, they may, in their own minds, be addressing a very specific and very tight-knit audience. This audience may be looking at one another and thinking, deciding as a group what they can say, what they should say, what they will say. Isn't that what was going on in this fun house as well? When the boys left to get names and numbers, wasn't that to have a little bit of a council meeting? How are we going to handle this? What are we going to say? Is everyone ready to do whatever? In any event, the trust meter in what we are dealing with, what we are getting from them, can't be at maximum. Do you see that? But somewhere closer to the middle. Unfortunately, the issue of trust isn't unique to the survivors or their pals. We don't know if we can trust the chef, for example, who reported hearing a scream. A month later, is what Inan Harsh said 100% trustworthy? How can we rely on what Joe said when he vouched for Hoodie Guy being a solid guy? Is that true? Or the vape store dude? The legacy of the Kylie Rodney case was that the cops are inept. Don't trust them. Leave it to social media to solve cases. Trust social media. There is also generally in America a decline in trust levels for law enforcement. Right now, trust in government institutions in America are near all-time lows. We hear repeatedly about Moscow PD talking about difficulty in terms of resources and being overwhelmed. Recently, someone contacted me and asked me if I didn't think someone from law enforcement committed this crime. The theme of a breach of trust seems to apply more to this crime perhaps than we've realized until now. What happens emotionally, psychologically, when you stand at the door and you trust someone when they say they're going to come back and talk to you, and then they close the door and you wait and they don't come back? What does that do to someone in that situation? You can see inside the house from the outside, you can hear what's going on, and yet you remain on the outside. You remain locked out. What happens over time? What feelings start to percolate while you're waiting out there in the cold?
I guarantee you they're associated with this story. As many of them are living here at some off-campus sorority house. I've been a cop for 22 years here. I'm not stupid. Don't play dumb games with me. I'd rather deal with this as a noise complaint than getting a hold of the Greek council and the Greek board and all of that, listening to students and playing all these stupid fucking games.
So I'm not going to take it further than that. I will be doing a live later today dealing with the latest news. There's been another press release from law enforcement, so we're going to be looking at that and certain other things. So look out for that. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.